Okay, here is my teacher work sample, my 10 lessons. What I will be teaching is form in poetry. This would be in language arts classes for the 7th grade level. The purpose of this unit is to teach students about poetry. It teaches a lot of different literacy concepts and tools. According to Ben Curran from Education Week Teacher, that's a magazine, the ELA anchor standards call upon students to be able to make inferences, cite specific textual evidence, to support conclusions and answers, to determine, analyze the theme of a text, to analyze the way ideas develop over the course of a text, interpret words and phrases, analyze connotative and figurative meanings of words, analyze how word choice shapes a text, analyze the structure of a text, assess how point of view shapes a text, analyze how two texts address the same theme. And I look at this and think, poetry, poetry, poetry. So poetry is a really good thing to teach language arts students, to give them a very diverse tool belt of things they can use. So they will be able to recognize, analyze, interpret, assess, explain, construct, and create poetry. By the end of the unit, the students will be able to recognize and explain the different forms of concrete poetry, haiku, and limericks, explain and demonstrate how many syllables are in haiku and limericks, use the form and the words of a poem to identify the meaning, express themselves by writing their own concrete poem, haiku, and/or limerick, recognize a verse novel, and explain how the form contributes to the meaning. So in lesson number 1, the students will be introduced to poetry. The lesson objective is to correctly recognize and explain what a haiku, concrete, and limerick poem look and sound like. All of my lessons accomplish Anchor Standard 1, read closely to determine what the text says explicitly, and to make logical inferences from it, cite specific textual evidence when writing or speaking to support conclusions drawn from the text, and then Anchor Standard 5, analyze how a drama's or poem's form or structure contributes to its meaning. So here's the language and vocabulary. They're going to be able to recognize and explain, and they're going to learn haiku, concrete poem, limerick, rhyme, syllable, and line. So what I'll need is the class notebook. The students will begin every class by writing in their class notebook. So this first class, they will be asked to begin a KWL, know, want to know, and learned form in their classroom notebooks. But they're only going to fill out the K and the W section. We just want to find out what they know before we dive into poetry. Then after that, we're going to introduce the different types. So the first thing I'll talk about is the Big Blue Whale and Spring's Way. I'm going to put those side by side. So the Big Blue Whale over here, and then we'll do, I think this is the right one. Okay, so then I was going to ask them what is interesting about these poems, what makes them different, and eventually we're going to get to the point of that these are concrete poems. And what a concrete poem is it's a poem that is written in a certain shape that goes with the poem. So the one on the left is a snake, and the one on the right is a whale. And so I'm gonna teach these students how to make a concrete poem. But first we would spend some time learning about it. Okay, so then I would do, I would show them Lazy Jane, which is also a concrete poem. And this is by Shel Silverstein. And it's just written in the shape of what the poem is saying. So then, okay, find Spring's Way. Okay, so then I would put this up and I would say, is this a concrete poem? And we would talk about why it's not a concrete poem. And then I would introduce to them the idea of a haiku. So this one is actually 3 haikus, but we would talk about the form. So a haiku is 5 syllables and then 7 syllables and then 5 syllables. And usually it's nature related, not always. So we talk about haiku, and then we would move on to limericks. And let's see. A limerick is a poem that rhymes. The first and second line rhyme with the last line. I have it all written down here. And we would go over just a few examples. So I have this example, and then I also have several examples on here. So there's lots and lots of examples. So we talk about some of those. Okay, so then at the end of class, we would have this. We would practice clapping with the syllables, so they understood what the syllables needed to sound like in the haiku and the limerick. So then for the last few minutes, I would have the students turn and explain to their neighbor and explain the 3 types of poetry, and I would monitor and listen and see if I feel like the students have picked up what I needed them to pick up. So accommodations. The kids that are more shy or quiet, I would call on them by name so that they would contribute to the class discussion. And then if the kids were having a difficult time sitting listening to my direct instruction, they would be allowed to sit on their desks or come closer to the board. Okay, so then my second lesson, we're going to practice. So the lesson objective is that they will be able to recognize and explain what a haiku, concrete, and limerick poem look like. That's the same as before. So for the first 5 minutes, they would continue their KWL from the day before, and they would do the L section to see what they learned. And then we would talk as a class about what they learned the day before. So then I would divide the kids into groups of 3 or 4, and they would each be given a haiku worksheet. We'd have them work on that for 10 minutes and then stop. The idea is just to have them practice. I don't necessarily want them to have a final poem. If they finish, they can do another one. I just want them to get the hang of writing a haiku, and hopefully while they're in groups, they would be able to help each other. Same with the lyric. They would have 10 minutes to quickly do a lyric. That's not a lot of time to do a limerick, but again, I just want them to kind of get some practice with each other. So then we would talk about, and so then they would do a concrete poem. We'd give them a blank sheet of paper. I have worksheets for the haiku and for the limerick. So here's the limerick template to help them write it, and then here's the haiku template. So then we would talk about it, which poem was more difficult, why, were you able to convey the message that you wanted to, what were some of the stumbling blocks that you ran into, and then we would talk about their homework for that night, which would be to brainstorm ideas because they're going to be asked to write their own poem tomorrow. So the next day, they would first write in their notebooks. The prompt would be that Rita Dev said, "Poetry is language at its most distilled and most powerful. What do you think she means by this?" So we'll have them fill that out, and then a few volunteers will share. And then they'll be given the remainder of the class to make their own, either haiku, limerick, or concrete poem. So the teacher would be walking around to make sure that they understood and to help if they needed help. If the students finished early, they would either help or they could do another poem. If the students are struggling, they can have one-on-one help with the teacher, or they can ask for help from a friend. They'll be able to converse with each other, and individual music can be listened to with their iPods if they want to do that. So they would have a final poem. They could either present it or they could just display it if they didn't feel comfortable presenting it. So the next day, they would write in their notebook entry again. The prompt would be to have great poets. There must be great audiences. Do you agree with this statement? Why or why not? And then we would talk about that as a class. And then the students will present. So they can either present it by reading it or they can present it by displaying it. And either way, they'll be graded according to, so I want correct form. I want to make sure the syllables are in the right places, lines are structured correctly. just the form is correct. The presentation, did they really put some effort into it? Was it relevant? And then participation. So for accommodations, students will be able to have a fidget spinner or something so that while they're listening to their peers so that they aren't distracting. And then because they can present it in different ways, that is accommodating those that might not feel comfortable doing it in front of everyone. So then we're going to switch gears just a little bit, but we're going to stay in poetry, and we are going to begin our crossover. Crossover is a novel, and okay, so we're going to have them write in their notebook, and the prompt is, a verse is writing arranged with a metrical rhythm, typically having a rhyme, and try to think of a few uses of verses in your life. So I want to just brainstorm with the students where they've heard verses, when they've used those, so that they kind of can get an idea of what that is. So then we'll talk about journal entries, and we'll talk about what a verse is. And then all the students will be given a copy of Crossover to follow along while it's read. The book on tape will be read. So I will be walking around, and I'm hoping that the book is exciting enough that they'll pay attention to it. So if the students need to come closer to the speakers, they can, again with the fidget spinners, but hopefully as they're following along in the book, that will keep them from getting crazy. So we'll do that for a few classes, but every day we'll have a different notebook entry so we can talk about how the novel is progressing. So then by the end, on the last lesson, I will introduce their final poetry essay. So I want to be able, so the student will write an essay about a poem. The student will first select the poem that is interesting to them. They can choose from any of the passages of Crossover or any of the poems that the teacher presented in class, and then they'll analyze that selection. So then there's a list of questions that they can use. I just want them to, if you look at the, I can't think of the word. I want to know that they understand that the form of poetry contributes to the poem's meaning, and to be able to look at the poem and analyze it and tell me what it means and why. So they will need to, they'll have the rest of the time to work. And then, okay, so the accommodations, when students that aren't as advanced, I'll allow them to write one page. For more advanced students, I'll allow them to find their own poem that's more complex or provide more complex poetry. And then if students complete this assignment early, I will allow them to either work on missing work, well, first work on missing work from this class, then when all missing work is turned in, they can read a book or work on homework from other classes. I'll also have a crossword puzzle they can do if they want extra credit. So then the last class, they will have that whole time to work on their essay. So that gives them about an hour and a half of class time so they can work on their essays. And then they'll be graded on that to see, to be the conclusion of the poetry unit. So that is my unit, and I think it would be fun and interesting, and thanks for listening.